How did a nation that had owned a territory for 150 years manage to know almost nothing about its coastline? Nothing useful, nothing current, nothing that would tell a military commander where to put 4,000 men ashore in the dark without killing them on the beach before a single enemy soldier opened fire. How did the decision that determined the outcome of the Falklands War rest entirely on a penciled notebook that the Royal Navy's own chief hydrographer had dismissed in writing as the amateur jottings of an itinerant yachtsman and of no value to this department, a document so thoroughly rejected by the institution it would save that its author had tried and failed to sell it as a sailing guide? And why, at the moment that mattered most, when Britain's closest ally was providing satellites and missiles and signals intelligence, did British intelligence officers deliberately keep the Americans in the dark about the one operation that made everything else possible? Not because they distrusted the Americans, but because they understood, with cold precision, exactly what the Americans might do with it. The Falklands War lasted 74 days. The reconnaissance that made it winnable lasted 3 weeks. It was conducted by men who lay motionless in frozen peat scrapes on a wind-swept hillside, who walked for miles through enemy-held territory in Antarctic winter darkness to tap out Morse code because a single radio transmission from their position could have destroyed everything, and who carried their most important findings back by hand because what they had measured could not be trusted to any channel that might be observed. They operated on islands that the British military had barely mapped and almost entirely forgotten. Their most significant discovery was not about beaches or tides or Argentine gun emplacements. It was about an assumption made in Buenos Aires about how Britain would fight, an assumption built on watching what America did and concluding that Britain would do the same. The Argentines made that assumption. Britain proved them wrong, and the Americans, who were supplying both sides with intelligence simultaneously without realizing it, were the last to know. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments whether you had heard of the Special Boat Service's Falklands Reconnaissance before today, because what you are about to discover will change the story you thought you already knew. Watch until the end, because the truth about how the Falklands were really won begins with a Royal Marine officer sitting in a bathtub. Then let's go. To understand what happened in those 3 weeks in May of 1982, one must first grasp the problem that nobody in the British military had ever seriously tried to solve. Britain had held the Falkland Islands since 1833. For 149 years, the islands had been a British overseas territory, remote, economically marginal, diplomatically contested, and strategically overlooked. The charts covering their coastline dated, in many areas, from the mid-Victorian era. They had not been updated to reflect changes in inshore conditions. They did not contain accurate-sounding data close enough to the beach to plan a landing. The kelp, vast underwater forests of macrocystis that could disable a landing craft's propellers before it reached the shore, was not accurately plotted. The Hydrographic Department of the Royal Navy had not regarded detailed updating of Falklands inshore surveys as a priority, which was a reasonable position for as long as nobody was planning to fight there. The Argentine military junta did not consult the Royal Navy's priorities when it planned its invasion. On the 2nd of April, 1982, Argentine forces landed at Mullet Creek south of Stanley and at York Bay near the airport. The small Royal Marines garrison of Naval Party 8901, 68 men under Major Mike Norman, fought for over an hour before surrendering, because 68 men fighting 3,000 is not a military calculation. It is a gesture. The islands were Argentine. The question was whether they would remain so. Britain's response was immediate. The government dispatched a naval task force within days. By the 5th of April, The first elements were sailing south under the overarching designation of Operation Corporate, commanded by Admiral Sir John Fieldhouse at Northwood. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward led the carrier battle group. Commodore Michael Clapp commanded the amphibious task group, the ships that would actually put men ashore. Brigadier Julian Thompson of 3 Commando Brigade commanded the landing force. These were the men who would have to decide where to land 4,000 soldiers on a coast 8,000 miles from home, against an enemy that had been reinforcing and preparing for weeks. Woodward's assessment of their intelligence position was unsparing. His forces had, in his own phrase, very considerable ignorance about the seas around the Falklands. The charts were outdated in most areas. Inshore data was insufficient for planning a landing. Their knowledge of beach conditions, approach channels, and Argentine defensive dispositions was, at the moment the task force sailed, essentially non-existent. A landing on the wrong beach, on one that looked suitable on a 50-year-old survey, but was silted up, or approached through uncharted kelp, or overlooked by Argentine artillery, meant putting 4,000 men into darkness on a shore that might destroy the operation before Argentina fired a shot. The planners aboard HMS Fearless, sailing south in the first days of April, faced a specific and quietly terrifying constraint. They could send the Special Boat Squadron to examine a handful of candidate beaches. Not more. To identify the handful worth examining, they would need something that did not officially exist. On the 2nd of April, the day Argentina invaded, a Royal Marines officer arrived unannounced at Hamoa's house in Plymouth, headquarters of 3 Commando Brigade, with a rolled-up set of charts and a hand-drawn notebook under his arm. He had not been summoned. He had submitted no memorandum. He simply arrived and asked to speak to Brigadier Julian Thompson, because he understood, before the telephones began ringing in Whitehall, that what he was carrying was the only thing of its kind in existence. His name was Ewan Southby Taylor. He was a major in the Royal Marines, 40 years old, an amphibious specialist with 32 years of service that had taken him from Aden to Northern Ireland, to Oman, to 13 winters in the Norwegian Arctic, developing fast raiding and assault craft for commando operations. He was also, as it would transpire, the only person in the British military who had spent a year sailing methodically around the Falkland Islands, measuring depth soundings from a yacht, sketching inshore approach channels, recording kelp positions, noting beach gradients, and writing all of it down. The story of why he had done this is not quite what it appears. In December of 1977, Southby Taylor attended a briefing at the Directorate of Naval Plans. His orders for the Falklands posting, commanding Naval Party 8901 from 1978 to 1979, included alongside standard garrison instructions a specific additional brief from the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He was to rewrite the concept of operations for the island's defense and identify a beach through which a special forces party could land in advance of a task force in the event of an Argentine invasion. He was being sent, in other words, to produce the intelligence his own navy would eventually need. He simply did not know when. He arrived in March of 1978 and spent his year doing 2 things simultaneously. He commanded the garrison, and he sailed. He worked the coastline systematically in his own yacht, in all weather, producing a notebook of more than 100 pages, penciled depth soundings, hand-drawn charts of approach channels, notes on tidal patterns, observations of kelp positions that the Admiralty maps did not show. When he returned to England in 1979 and presented the work to the Navy's chief hydrographer, he received a professional verdict that history would record as one of the more costly misjudgments of the decade. The notes were dismissed as the amateur jottings of an itinerant yachtsman and of no value to this department. He tried to publish it as a yachtsman's guidebook. Publishers were not interested. On the 2nd of April, 1982, Thompson looked at the notebook for a few minutes and understood immediately what he was holding. So did Commodore Clapp. The only detailed inshore survey of many of these beaches since the Victorian era was in pencil in a spiral-bound notebook, and the man who had made it was standing in their headquarters. South Betelgeuse had a condition. He came with the notebook. He would not hand it over to a filing system. He was appointed navigational and amphibious advisor to the task force and eventually given command of the combined landing craft assault squadrons. Aboard HMS Fearless, sailing south, every workspace was occupied by the controlled chaos of a navy, assembling an amphibious operation as it went. The senior officer's bathroom contained a bath large enough to spread charts across. South Betelgeuse set up there. The man whose work had been called worthless now sat in a bathtub aboard an assault ship heading to war, surrounded by hand-drawn charts of beaches that no one else in the task force had visited, answering questions from planners who had begun to understand that the entire operation depended on what he had written down in his spare time on a posting nobody had wanted. The most strategically important military document in Britain's possession in 1982 was a penciled notebook in a bath. The chief hydrographer's verdict on it was not revised. What the notebook solved immediately was the problem of scale. The SBS could examine perhaps half a dozen beaches in the time available. The Falklands archipelago contains approximately 200 islands. Without South Betelgeuse's notes, the planners could not meaningfully have narrowed the list because the Victorian charts gave no reliable indication of which approaches were navigable and which were traps. With the notebook, they could eliminate every beach that looked promising on old surveys, but that South Betelgeuse knew would destroy landing craft in the kelp, or that had silted since the last measurement, or whose approach channels had been mistakenly plotted. The notebook converted an impossible reconnaissance problem into a manageable one. Now someone had to act on it. The men chosen to do that had already left Britain. On the night before the invasion, the Special Boat Squadron's commanding officer, returning from winter exercises in Norway, blocked his unit's scheduled leave on the working assumption that something was coming. The following morning, his assumption was confirmed. Within 24 hours of the alert signal, the SBS was moving. The fastest available route to the South Atlantic was not a surface ship. HMS Conqueror, a Churchill-class nuclear attack submarine, departed Faslane in Scotland on the 3rd of April, 1982, carrying 16 men of 6 SBS and approximately 6 tons of their equipment. Conqueror was built to hunt enemy warships and conduct intelligence operations in Soviet waters. She had in fact been trailing a Soviet Victor-class nuclear submarine at the moment she was ordered to store for war and head south, loading 16 soldiers and 6 tons of weapons, explosives, Gemini raiding craft, breathing apparatus, and specialist diving equipment into her torpedo room was not what she had been designed for. The crew was reduced to accommodate the additional men. To compensate, the SBS operators were used to help crew the submarine on passage south. 22 days submerged, 60 feet below the South Atlantic. 16 additional men in a vessel not designed for passengers, moving at sustained speed toward a war that had not yet officially begun when they sailed. This detail does not appear in most accounts of the campaign. There was a structural problem. Nuclear submarines are poorly suited to shallow water inshore operations in kelp-infested coastal approaches. Their size and acoustic signature in confined waters make them dangerous vehicles for delivering a 4-man raiding craft to within swimming distance of a beach at 2 in the morning. From the beginning of the planning process, Clapp and the SBS commanding officer had requested a diesel-electric submarine, specifically HMS Onyx, for the insertion phase. Onyx was smaller, quieter in constricted waters, and entirely suited to easing a Gemini inflatable into a Falklands Sound inlet without being heard from shore. The request was acknowledged. HMS Onyx was prepared and dispatched. She arrived at San Carlos on the 31st of May, 1982, 10 days after the landings were complete. Clapp's recorded response was measured to the point of precision. It was, he wrote, a great pity. On the 26th of April, after 22 days submerged, Conqueror surfaced in the South Atlantic. A photograph now held in the Imperial War Museum shows men on the submarine's casing in daylight, with HMS Antrim and HMS Plymouth standing off her bow, the men cross-decking, transferring from the submarine to the surface warships that would carry them into the operational area. It is a photograph of improvisation at every level. Soldiers inside a navy, inside a war that was being constructed as it was fought, heading toward an operation whose success depended on intelligence that had not yet been gathered. By this point, the Special Forces component of Operation Corporate totaled approximately 84 SBS operators and 128 SAS soldiers, against more than 8,000 Argentine troops on the islands. 2 SBS had flown ahead to Ascension Island to join surface ships. 3 SBS would arrive later. D Squadron and G Squadron of 22nd Special Air Service were already embarked with the carrier battle group. The division of labor between the two units was clear. G Squadron SAS would conduct long-range strategic observation, watching Stanley, Fox Bay, Port Howard, and the northern approaches to Falkland Sound. The SBS would focus on the beaches. Clapp had specifically requested SAS observation of Falkland Sound in order to free an SBS team for the beach work, because he was concerned about enemy ship movements and possible mining in that area. The intelligence picture they were about to construct would determine where 4,000 men stepped ashore. On the night of the 1st of May, 1982, as the carrier battle group came within helicopter range of the islands, the first SBS reconnaissance teams went in. Sea King Mark IV helicopters of 846 Naval Air Squadron, running without lights in total darkness, delivered 4-man patrols to pre-selected points on East Falkland. The delivery points were chosen far enough from the intended observation positions that rotor noise would not betray the destination. The helicopters touched the ground for seconds and departed. The men were alone on an Argentine-held island. What they stepped into was not the jungle of films or the hedgerows of Normandy. The Falkland Islands in May sit at the latitude of southern Patagonia, 2 months from midwinter. Average daytime temperature near 0 Celsius. Sustained westerly wind at force 4 to 6, driving the felt temperature far below. Rain, sleet, and at altitude, snow. The landscape is open peat moorland. No trees, no ravines, no dense vegetation. In the Falklands, concealment meant being below the ground. The teams cut scrapes, shallow trenches in the peat, covered with waterproofed camouflage nets and clumps of moorland vegetation. They lay in these positions through daylight hours. They could not cook, could not speak above a whisper, could not stand to relieve the cramp building in their legs across 8 and 10 and 12 hours of forced stillness. Argentine search parties were active. A single careless silhouette against a ridge, a metallic glint from an optical instrument, a curl of steam from a warm canteen. Any of these could compromise not just the patrol, but the entire enterprise. The men in the scrapes were the nervous system of a landing plan that had not yet been finalized. Their continued existence and their silence was the condition on which everything else rested. The communication difficulty had a history that made it worse. In 1981, the SBS had proposed a proving exercise, testing their burst transmission equipment from terrain equivalent to the Falklands to verify the sets could be operated securely in that environment. The proposal was refused on the grounds that the results would never be relevant. In May of 1982, lying in hides overlooking San Carlos water, the men discovered what that refusal had cost them. A radio transmission from their position risked detection by Argentine signals intelligence. One burst from the San Carlos area could have revealed not just a patrol's location, but the entire purpose of what was being watched. Could have told any Argentine officer paying attention that a beach reconnaissance was underway, that the British had found a gap in the defensive line, and that San Carlos was the gap they had found. So they walked. Patrols that had spent 8 to 12 hours motionless in saturated peat would leave their hides under cover of darkness, move for miles across enemy-held moorland to reach a point sufficiently distant from their observation position, transmit their Morse code reports, and return before first light. Beach reconnaissance data, gradient measurements, depth soundings, kelp positions, approach channel assessments was too complex for Morse transmission at all. It was carried by hand. Men were extracted by helicopter, taken back to HMS Fearless, briefed the planners face-to-face, and in some cases, reinserted into the same or a different position. This was not the process that had been planned. It was the process that the circumstances required. What the teams were finding, night by night and patrol by patrol, confirmed the planners' most optimistic reading. No evidence of mine-laying in Falklands Sound. No mines in San Carlos water. Minimal Argentine presence in the San Carlos area. Ajax Bay, an abandoned refrigeration plant on the western shore of San Carlos water that would eventually serve as the field hospital for the entire campaign, had been under observation since early May. Empty. Suitable. Accessible. The beach gradients were right. The kelp positions were navigable. The approaches were clear. But something else was taking shape in the picture, and it was less about what the teams were finding than about what was absent from their reports. The Argentines were not at San Carlos. Their forces were massed around Stanley on the eastern coast. Their preparations faced east. The whole military disposition of the garrison pointed in one direction and left another entirely open. G Squadron observation posts near Stanley and Fox Bay were confirming the same pattern from the opposite angle. The Argentines had concentrated their strength toward a threat they anticipated. The question was what they anticipated, and why. The assumption had a name, and its name was the United States Marine Corps. While SBS teams lay in their scrapes watching the tidal margins of San Carlos, Alexander Haig was running between London and Buenos Aires. The Reagan administration's position in April of 1982 was genuinely divided. Haig, the Secretary of State, had launched active shuttle diplomacy and had not yet abandoned it. Reagan himself reportedly found the whole crisis difficult to comprehend. Two allies fighting over what he described as that little ice-cold bunch of land down there. At one of Haig's London meetings, Thatcher had listened to a proposal for an interim administrative arrangement on the islands and replied with a question that closed the discussion. Interim authority. To do what? Haig sat, by one American participant's account, nervously tapping his leg and chain-smoking, while the Prime Minister made her position clear in terms that admitted no ambiguity. American assistance during this period was genuine and substantial. The NSA had retasked a satellite from Central American surveillance duties to cover the South Atlantic, though GCHQ had needed to negotiate persistently for even this and received access only for limited periods. The CIA had provided a comprehensive order of battle for the Argentine military. The National Reconnaissance Office repositioned a dedicated satellite over the operational area. Britain accepted all of it. Britain did not tell the Americans about San Carlos. The reason was structural rather than personal. Haig's mediation remained active into May. The State Department had channels open to Buenos Aires. If specific operational details, men on the ground, beaches confirmed clear, an undefended coast identified, had moved through standard intelligence sharing protocols, they might have reached people who had reasons not to keep them. A single Argentine intelligence officer who understood what beach reconnaissance meant would have understood immediately that the British had located the gap in their defensive line. The coast would have been reinforced. The beaches would have been mined. The operation would have become something very different from what it was. What the British intelligence community did not know, and would only learn from post-war declassification, was that the Americans were simultaneously providing satellite imagery to Argentina, not through malice, through a pre-existing NASA Memorandum of Understanding that legally obligated the United States to supply satellite coverage of the South Atlantic to Argentina under commercial arrangements that predated the conflict. The National Reconnaissance Office had repositioned a satellite to cover the war for Britain. NASA was legally required to provide equivalent imagery to Argentina under a separate obligation that nobody had thought to suspend. The most powerful intelligence organization in the world was supplying both sides with identical material under two bureaucratic mandates that had never been designed to coexist. The British, who had refused to share operational details through channels they could not control, had been right for reasons they did not yet fully know. The Argentine commanders had made their own independent calculation, and it had nothing to do with satellite imagery. They had studied Western amphibious doctrine. They knew what the United States Marine Corps did when it conducted large-scale landings. It aimed for the objective, chose the most direct route, and brought maximum force to bear in minimum time. The political prize was Stanley. The direct route was the eastern coast. General Mario Menendez had positioned his forces accordingly, concentrated around the capital, oriented to meet an assault from the sea on the coast that the doctrine he understood said the British would use. Britain had not read Menendez's appreciation. They did not need to. Their own doctrine, built patient and methodical through 12 years in Malaya, refined in Borneo, tested in Northern Ireland, was constitutionally resistant to the obvious approach. They chose the unexpected angle not because it was unconventional, but because it was correct. The beach 50 miles away on the opposite coast, around the corner of the island, protected from exocet attack by the surrounding terrain, too distant from Stanley for a rapid counterattack, and unguarded because no one had thought to defend the coast they did not expect to be attacked from. That was San Carlos. The SBS had confirmed it was clear. Southby Taylor's notebook had confirmed it was suitable. On the 10th of May, 1982, the decision was formalized. San Carlos was the landing site. The single code word "Palpas" was prepared for transmission when the War Cabinet gave its authority to proceed. All that remained was the final confirmation from the ground, and one last problem to solve before the ships entered Falkland Sound. The fortnight between the formal selection of San Carlos and D-Day was the most operationally tense period of the reconnaissance. The plan was locked. The fleet was converging. Everything now depended on the men in the hides continuing to report an absence of enemy activity, because absence was the answer the plan required. Clapp described the silences that sometimes fell between SBS reports as producing a period rather too long for Julian's and my nerves, when we heard little or nothing from the men ashore. He could not distinguish from HMS Fearless between silence that meant the beaches remained clear and silence that meant something had gone wrong. The landing could not proceed without their reports. It could not wait indefinitely. The southern winter was advancing. On the 15th of May, SBS teams were inserted by HMS Brilliant at Grantham Sound for the definitive final confirmation of the San Carlos beaches. 6 days before D-Day, the surveys held. The gradients were correct, the approaches navigable, the Argentine presence non-existent. Then, with the fleet already moving toward Falkland Sound, an SBS team conducting a last-minute check of 3 Paras Green Beach at Port San Carlos Settlement, made a discovery that forced an immediate revision of the first wave composition. The Argentine Strategic Reserve, which planning had positioned at Fitzroy well to the south, was not at Fitzroy. It was north of Darwin, much closer to Sussex Mountain, the high ground Tupara needed to occupy before any counterattack could threaten the bridgehead. If Tupara landed in the second wave as originally planned, they might find Argentine forces already on the objective before they reached it. The decision was made while the fleet was at sea, in the final hours before the operation began. Tupara was moved to the first wave with a 10-minute advance on 40 Commando, giving them a clear run to Sussex Mountain before any Argentine reaction could organize. A revision of this significance, executed at this moment, based on a single report from a 4-man patrol in a scrape on a hillside. This is the precise function the entire reconnaissance had been designed to serve. Not simply to verify that beaches existed, to provide the granular, current intelligence that allowed last-minute adaptation without general alarm. Simultaneously, the deception plan reached its climax. Operation Tornado sent HMS Glamorgan to bombard Berkeley Sound with 100 rounds of Starshell and high explosive, her helicopter flying spoof missions, her communications team running deceptive radio circuits. The aim was to confirm in Argentine minds what Menendez already believed, that the British were coming from the east. It worked. At approximately 1 in the morning on the 21st of May, 1982, a Wessex helicopter from HMS Antrim swept the ridge of Fanning Head with its thermal imaging device. The screen showed what the observer described as clusters of bright glowworms in pairs, the heat signatures of human bodies arranged in the pattern of a military observation post with heavy weapons. 15 such signatures. Several groups along the ridge and a concentration at the summit. The Argentine post that the SBS had identified during the reconnaissance phase was precisely where they had reported it. Fanning Head was not a machine gun nest. It was an artillery platform. The Argentine unit, Combat Team Güemes, 62 men under First Lieutenant Carlos Esteban, had been deployed to the area on the 15th of May, specifically because HMS Alacrity's earlier passage through Falklands Sound had suggested British interest in the area. 19 men under Second Lieutenant Roberto Reyes manned the observation post. The equipment included 105mm recoilless rifles and 81mm mortars, weapons capable of engaging not just the landing craft, but the frigates and destroyers standing off to protect them. The reconnaissance had found this position. What followed was its direct consequence. 3 SBS, approximately 25 to 35 men by various accounts, were delivered by helicopter to a point 6.5 kilometers from the ridge. The initial payload had been too heavy for a single flight. 4 separate lifts were needed. With them was Captain Hugh McManners of 148 Commando Forward Observation Battery, a naval gunfire specialist, and Captain Rod Bell, a Spanish-speaking psychological operations officer who had brought a loudspeaker with the intention of calling for surrender in the language the defenders spoke. HMS Antrim opened fire, airburst rounds at 500 feet, walking toward the Argentine position. McManners directed the battery. The ridge disappeared in successive detonations that, by one participant's account, turned night into day. When the guns paused, Captain Bell raised the loudspeaker and called for surrender. The answer was machine gun fire. The SBS moved forward through the smoke and the dark, closing the distance, getting within hand grenade range of the position. When the defenders had absorbed what they could absorb, they surrendered. 11 Argentines were killed. 6 surrendered. The remainder fled into the hills. The SBS had no fatalities. The weapons that could have turned the first wave of landing craft into burning wreckage were silenced before a single British soldier crossed the line of departure. At 2:30 in the morning, Local time, the first landing craft were moving toward the beaches. At Blue Beach, Green Beach, Red Beach, and Ajax Bay, every gradient reading and kelp observation and channel assessment that men had carried back across enemy-held moorland was being rendered into navigation. South Battalion led the waves of craft into San Carlos water in the dark, steering by charts he had drawn from a yacht 4 years earlier, toward beaches he had penciled into a notebook that his own profession had dismissed. Every soldier who stepped ashore that night was walking on ground that had been examined, measured, and confirmed by men whose names do not appear in most accounts of the landing. The Argentine High Command at Stanley received the Fanning Head Report at approximately 5 in the morning. Menendez's staff initially assessed the situation as a British diversionary action, a raid designed to draw attention while the real landing came elsewhere, near Stanley, as the doctrine they had studied predicted it would. They did not immediately deploy reserves toward San Carlos. The assumption held for long enough. The bridgehead was established by dawn. Argentina's Air Force, once Menendez understood what had happened, responded with skill and ferocity. The warships anchored in San Carlos water, Bomb Alley as the British called it, came under sustained attack from mainland-based aircraft, flying at wave height through the Sound. HMS Ardent was hit 9 times and sank the following evening. HMS Antelope was struck and sank when attempts to defuse an unexploded bomb failed. HMS Coventry went down 5 days after the landing. The container ship Atlantic Conveyor, hit by an Exocet missile on the 25th of May, was lost, along with 3 Chinook and 6 Wessex helicopters, virtually the entire British heavy lift capability for the land campaign. The task force paid a severe price in ships and men for operating without air superiority. But the troops were ashore. The Argentine ground forces, massed around Stanley on the far side of the island, could not reach the bridgehead in time to contest it. 3 weeks of fighting followed. Goose Green on the 28th of May, where Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones was killed, leading 2 para in daylight, and received a posthumous Victoria Cross. The long march across the Peat by 45 Commando and 3 para. The helicopter assault on Mount Kent. The brigade night attacks on Longdon and Tumbledown, and Wireless Ridge in the 2nd week of June. 255 British military personnel were killed. 775 were wounded. 649 Argentine military dead. 3 Falkland Islander civilians killed by Argentine fire. On the 14th of June, 1982, Brigadier General Mario Menendez surrendered to Major General Jeremy Moore in Stanley. The man who had concentrated his entire defense toward the wrong coast signed the documents in a room his forces had held for 74 days. Post-war interrogations of Argentine prisoners confirmed what the intelligence picture had suggested throughout. The Darwin garrison had genuinely believed itself under attack by an entire British battalion on D-Day night. The 45 SAS men who raided the settlement had been reported up the chain as a major assault force. Menendez had received the Darwin report and the Fanning Head report simultaneously, and concluded that both were the prelude to the Stanley landing he had always expected. His assumption had been the mechanism of his defeat. Of the 255 British military personnel who died in the Falklands War, not one died on a landing beach. 1 member of the SBS did not come home. Sergeant Ian Hunt, Kiwi to the men who served beside him, was killed on the 2nd of June, 1982, by an SAS patrol near Teal. His team had moved through an area the SAS believed clear of friendly forces. In the dark, without coordinated communications, the patrol opened fire. Hunt was the only SBS fatality of the entire conflict. He died after the hard part was done, after the beaches had been confirmed, after the bridgehead was secure, after the Argentine ground forces had failed to dislodge it. He is commemorated, as all 255 British dead are commemorated. But the 3 weeks that made his final weeks possible, the work in the cold, the walks in the dark, the reports carried by hand across enemy-held hillsides, is not in any history that most people have read. The Americans eventually assembled the complete picture. Their own intelligence assessment, produced beforehand, had predicted a direct assault on Port Stanley, led by Scorpion light tanks. A reasonable prediction for a force fighting the way America would have fought. It was wrong. The intelligence agencies of the most powerful military nation on Earth had made, in their own analysis, the same error as Menendez. GCHQ drew its institutional conclusions. The satellite retasking had been valuable, but had required negotiation that should not have been necessary between allies of that standing. The willingness of individual Americans, most notably Caspar Weinberger's Department of Defense, which had begun providing non-public support before the official U.S. tilt toward Britain in late April, had been exceptional and personal. The structural vulnerability was something else. As one former GCHQ officer put it, with the economy of phrasing that intelligence professionals use when they mean something precisely. The Falklands brought going it alone back into fashion. This conviction contributed directly to Project Zircon, Britain's subsequent attempt to develop an autonomous signals intelligence satellite, ultimately cancelled on cost grounds, but motivated by the recognition that dependence on Allied goodwill was a liability the conflict had made visible. The SBS beach reconnaissance has not entered the popular record of the Falklands War in the way that the Pebble Island raid has, or the sinking of HMS Sheffield, or the battle at Goose Green. The Pebble Island raid, 45 SAS men destroying 11 Argentine aircraft in a 45-minute action, has the qualities that military history finds immediately accessible: a specific enemy, a specific objective, a specific outcome, and men shooting. 16 operators lying in frozen peat for a week, walking for miles in the dark to tap Morse, and carrying beach gradient data back by hand to an assault ship. This is harder to present, and has accordingly been largely passed over. The most consequential intelligence operation of the Falklands campaign lives primarily in the footnotes of a memoir co-written by the Commodore Amphibious Warfare and a Royal Marine officer who did some of his planning in a bathtub. Commodore Clapp's judgment on the SBS performance, recorded in that memoir, is the most complete official verdict available. The proof of his and his men's ability, Clapp wrote, was that they lost not a single man, while at the same time they collected the information without which the landings could not have proceeded. 2 clauses. Information the landings could not have proceeded without. Gathered at the cost of no lives. The Falklands War is remembered, rightly, as one of the most remarkable military achievements in modern British history. A task force assembled in days, sailed 8,000 miles, and recovered 2 islands from a prepared enemy. The men who sailed south marched across the peat and fought through the nights on the mountains above Stanley deserve exactly the recognition they have received. But the story most often told is the story of what happened after the beaches were secured. The beaches themselves were not taken by force. They were taken by knowledge. By a man who spent a year sailing around a coastline the Navy had told him was irrelevant, and who was proved right in the most complete way available to someone told he is wrong. By a unit that spent 3 weeks in the frozen dark, measuring and watching and walking and carrying, who came back with everything the planners needed and left not one of their own behind on the ground they had watched. The notebook exists. The beaches are still there. The men who lay in the hides are mostly gone now. But the story isn't gone. Now you know it. And if you think the people around you deserve to know it too, because they do, Because the men who spent 3 weeks in the cold earned at least that much. Share it. This is how the Falklands were really won. The least we can do is remember it.